much for joining us. Welcome to Tattered Cover Live, our virtual events that we do here at Tattered Cover Bookstore. My name is Mikaley. I'm the Director of Marketing and Events at Tattered Cover, and I'm really excited for this event that we have today. I want to just give you a couple of updates about how Tattered Cover's doing and what we're up to, because there's been changes all the time, and you should definitely be following us on multiple social media channels, as well as signing up for our newsletter. That's the best and fastest way to get updates on what Tattered Cover is doing. So for instance, we are now open for curbside pickup, which is amazing and so awesome. Thank you to the continued support through your online orders. You can still order online, but now, like I said, you can do curbside pickup if you live in the Denver metro area or if you're wanting to drive. Our website is also now open 24/7, yay! Which means we're getting caught up on orders. We're doing really well there. So thank you guys again for that. And you can browse our website. We're offering up recommendations all the time, such as our book of the month, cookbook of the month, and also all of these author events that we do. We have at least one bookseller, if not plenty more, who have read these books. And it's a huge reason as to why we picked these authors, which leads me into why we do this. Art is a survival resource, and it's something that's vitally important, but has very, very few safety nets, especially in crises like the one that we're facing now. We're here to affirm that creative work is essential, and we want to elevate it. It's always going to be our top priority at Tattered Cover. These authors have been chosen specifically because we love their work, and we can't stand the idea that they don't have a platform right now, and we think that you're going to love it too. We believe entirely that our communities need books as much as independent bookstores need our neighbor's business right now. And we know that Tattered Cover is a community space normally. Even our author tonight was telling me earlier about how it's always a must stop in Denver. And while we cannot be physically together, we're hoping that you guys can join us as a virtual community and that we can provide that opportunity and connect with you all this way. So thank you for joining us tonight. Also, just to let you know that this will be recorded on YouTube and closed captioning will be available for those who might need it. We have plenty of more live streams coming up. Definitely check out our website. We have a middle grade author for any of you who've got some young readers out there. Jessica Kim is going to be on Friday, May 22nd. And we also have William Kent Kruger on Thursday, May 28th. All of those are at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. But the author that we have today, I'm very excited for this one. Guys, my reading has expanded so much getting to do these author events, and this book is no exception. I'm just so excited to pick her brain. So Hadar Aviram is a Thomas Miller Professor of Law at the University of California Hastings College of Law. She's the author of Cheap on Crime, Recession-Era Politics, and the Transformation of American Punishment, and a co-editor of The Legal Process and the Promise of Justice. She's a frequent media commentator and runs the California Correctional Crisis blog. We're here to talk about her book, Yesterday's Monsters, and I'm going to be inviting Hadar to join me. I'm just going to turn on her video and everything here. Let me get her connected, and we'll get this show on the road. Let's see. Here we go. Hello, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. I know that you're a little bit behind. You're earlier than us, so thank you for hanging out with us before dinner time.
This is perfect. My toddler is napping, and I have time, and this is great.
Yay! I'm so glad
for doing this.
Oh, it's our pleasure, truly. Like we said in the intro, it's something that we really want to share your work, and thank you for taking the time to write this book. So why don't you give us a little bit of a summary what Yesterday's Monsters is about, and then you have a presentation for us, yes?
Sure. So Yesterday's Monsters is a book that talks about the parole process in California, and it uses a fairly unique lens. I'm assuming that many of the people listening to us on YouTube have heard about the Manson family members. And usually what you read about is the murders and the trial, and not a lot of people know what happened afterwards. Right. And this book is based on 50 years worth of all the parole transcripts of every parole hearing that the Manson family inmates have had since the late 70s. And through those stories, I tell a 50-year story arc of what happened with parole and with criminal justice and extreme punishment in California.
And it's so fascinating because you're right. When we think Manson family murders, we definitely don't go to what happened after the conviction. So, well, I'm going to hop off and let you share your screen and your presentation, and then we'll join us I'll join us back for a Q&A. So while Hadar is presenting, make sure you think of your questions.
Hello.
Take it away.
Here we go. There we go. So this is actually a topic that I figure a lot of people are more interested in now, because we've been hearing a lot about the question of whether to release people out of prisons, given what COVID-19 is doing inside prisons and all the people that are getting sick. And it's an opportunity for all of us to think a little bit about how we feel about people who have committed serious violent crime, and what does the back door out of prison look like for people like that. So to give you a little bit of an idea of the extent of how many people get out on parole in California, I'm just going to start with a little bit of numbers. So this is the number of parole releases sought and granted in California from 1978 onward to 2012. And you can see that thousands of people come up for parole every year, but only a very few get out. Just to kind of drive that point home again, this is the percentage of parole grants out of all suitability hearings. You can see that sort of during the 90s and until more or less the Great Recession of 2008, pretty much almost nobody got out. There were 3 governors that would not let anybody out. The parole board sort of responded by not letting anybody out. And it's only once Jerry Brown became governor and a few other changes happened that the doors of parole opened a little bit. So what is parole really? So parole comes from the French term for word, and it used to be the idea that you come up to be released from prison and you give your word that you're not going to commit crime again, and then you are let out. In California and in the states that still have parole boards, basically the parole hearing looks something like this. So every prison would have a room that looks like this. There's 3 parole commissioners. They're all political appointees of our governor, and they'll be sitting in the room, and there will be the inmate, the person who's seeking parole, trying to convince them to let them out. The inmate could be represented by a lawyer, and often they are, but the lawyer is not doing kind of like trial lawyer work, but rather just sitting there and helping the person prep for the hearing. The lawyers that I interviewed for the book have said that if the lawyer has to talk a lot during the hearing, it's probably bad news, because the commissioners want to hear more from the person who is asking for parole. Other people in the room include the prosecutor, the victims of the crime if they show up, a few other people, prison personnel, and there's a lot of paperwork involved. And then the Board of Commissioners decides whether they're going to recommend release or not. California is one of the few states that has 2 tiers of parole. So even if the board recommends that you're going to get out, you still have to wait 4 months. The governor has 4 months to look at the parole recommendation and decide whether they're going to approve it or veto it. So only if the board agrees to release you and then the governor agrees to release you, then you get out. So that's the way things work in California. So a little bit about the cases that are at the heart of my book. So some of our viewers might have heard about the Manson family members. For those that haven't, around 1967, a man by the name of Charlie Manson gets out of federal prison. At that point, he's already a very seasoned criminal. He's done more time inside than he's done outside for fairly violent crimes. And the first place that he goes out in 1967 after he gets out is to San Francisco. It's shortly after the Summer of Love. The Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in San Francisco is just ravaged with crime and violence and drugs, and lots of lost people looking for gurus, lots of charismatic guys with guitars looking for followers, so he's no different than other people. And he starts gathering a flock of disciples, followers, most of them young women, teenagers, and they start following him. They get a bus, they travel up and down the coast of California, and finally they find a movie ranch in Southern California where they settle down. It's called Spawn Ranch in LA. And they sort of hobnob a little bit with the counterculture, the music culture in LA. Manson's trying to break into the music scene unsuccessfully. And then in 1969, a group of Manson's followers commits 4 very, very heinous murders, which initially are not connected to each other, and it's only later that the police connects the dots. The first is the killing of a man by the name of Gary Hinman, who was a music teacher and acquaintance of the family. Then there's the iconic, famous murder of Sharon Tate, at the time 9 months pregnant with her child with Roman Polanski and 4 of her friends at their mansion in Cielo Drive. The following night, they murder Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, a married couple also living in LA. And then they kill Donald Shea, who was a ranch ranch hand at the ranch where they were living, Shorty Shea, because they were afraid that he was going to tell on them. Finally, the LAPD cracks the crime. They bring them to trial. And in 1971, all of the people who were on trial Charlie Manson, the three women known as the Manson girls, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten, and Tex Watson, a few other accomplices in other related trials, are all found guilty, and they all get the death penalty. But there's a reversal of fortune, because only a year after all these people are sentenced to death, the death penalty is abolished in California. So at the time, there's a case called People versus Anderson, in which the court says the death penalty is unconstitutional. It debases California. It's inhumane. They basically do away with it, and really angers people in California. Ronald Reagan, who is the governor at the time, is just outraged at the court, partly because they're all waiting to hear a Supreme Court decision in a case that some of you might have heard about, Furman versus Georgia, which is the case that actually halted the death penalty in the United States for 4 years between 1972 and 1976. But what really enrages people is that at the time, there are some pretty serious people on death row in California. And because of this decision, 107 people that are later known as the class of 72 all have their sentences commuted from death to life with parole. So some of you might be wondering, well, why didn't they just give them life without parole? Well, life without parole didn't exist in California until 1978. So the outcome of this decision was that everybody gets transferred to general prison in 1972. They're going to start coming up for parole in 1978. And even though this sounds really, really hard to imagine now with the very, very long sentences that we had, it was not outlandish at the time for somebody to be serving 10, 15 years for first-degree murder and then getting out. So there's a lot of outrage in California. People are very worried, and this crime becomes kind of like this symbolic thing. You know, there's could be nothing more evil than this, and we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And partly why this happens is because there's a series of books, chief among those is Helter Skelter, the book written by the prosecutor in the case, Vince Bugliosi, that are talking about this crime as being a product of this very sort of demonic apocalyptic cult. And the story is that Manson had told his followers that there was going to be a race war. Black people and white people were going to fight each other. Blood was going to flow down the streets. And once the black people win, they're going to look for a leader. And then Manson and his followers will come out of hiding and they will basically rule the world. So that's the story of what the story becomes. And everybody sort of buys into the idea that this is a crime that's very, very unique in its evil. One of the things that I come up in the book is that even though this story is factually true, it's a truth that hides other truths, because there are two other stories that you could tell about this crime. There's also a story, you can see those books in the second row, in the middle row. There's also a way to look at these crimes as not being so outlandish and being the crimes of common criminals. And there are some accounts, including accounts from the victims and from the offenders and from journalist Jeff Gwynne, that suggest that what actually happened was a drug deal gone bad. They tried to make amends with the Panthers, whom they really feared. Manson was very afraid of the Panther by getting money. They killed Gary Hinman because they were trying to get money out of him. And once Bobby Beausoleil, one of the family associates, got arrested for the Gary Hinman murder, they recreated the other crimes to be copycat crimes to sort of, throw the LAPD off the scent and show them that they've been on the wrong track, unsuccessfully, obviously. And then there's also another dimension to this crime that people don't often think about or didn't think about at the time, and that's the issue of the cult. Those are the books right at the bottom. And the idea is that these people were hopped out of their mind on drugs. Many of them were very young. They were very hungry. They didn't really have food. The women were regularly sexually exploited. Manson himself was a very violent man. And a lot of this factors into the way that we view the crime. Now, this is crucially important because the account in Helter Skelter, the story that Bugliosi tells, is a story that he crafted to a great extent for legal purposes. You see, under California law at the time, you couldn't convict of murder somebody that had not been on the murder scene itself without tying them very, very closely to the crime. He needed that story to tie Manson to the crimes. Manson himself was not on the crime scenes, while retaining the full criminal accountability of all the followers. But the story of the cult starts percolating after the convictions become real. Now, one of the things that some of you might think about is that just last year, a new Tarantino movie came out, basically telling the story of what happened before murders. And one of the reasons I really like the Tarantino book is the Tarantino movie is because it tells you a complicated story. Basically tells you all these three stories at once. Sort of this helter-skelter story, the common criminal story, the cult story. You get a little flavor of everything. Some of you will recognize this little scene from the movie, and you'll see, you can see that there's something very wrong going on there. This is the Brad Pitt character coming into the ranch to see what's going on there. There's something very wrong and very sinister going on, but you can also see the squalor, you can see the exploitation. So it's all there. And just to kind of like lend more credibility to the cult story, Manson was not the only person who was violent and scary and exploitative at the time. This guy in the picture is Father Yod, who is widely known as one of the granddaddies of health food in California. You see him here with some of his wives. Very, very scary man just as well. Here are the Moonies, who were very active in California at the time. And in fact, in the early 70s, worries about cults in California start amassing, so that in 1974, Marvin Dimley, who's the first African-American legislator in California, actually holds legislative hearings, and people who are in cults come to the hearings. Fathers and mothers of people in cults come in and say, please save our kids. And he says, there's nothing I can do. A lot of these people are adults. There's freedom of speech. Notably, a lot of the people that speak up at these hearings in 1974 are mentioning the Manson murders and saying, look, if we knew now meaning in 1974, if we knew then what we know now about cults, we probably wouldn't have sentenced the girls to death. They're probably victims. Think about now looking at this whole thing through a Me Too, lens and how we would perceive the murders at this point. The train is too late. The train of what to do with the Manson family's already left the station. In 1976, not only does the penalty come back big time to the United States with Gregg versus Georgia, but also California introduces something called the Determinate Sentencing Act, which is they change the way that they give punishment to serious crimes. And in 1978, California brings back the death penalty, creates life without parole. And in the explanation to these bills, they repeatedly say, we're doing this because we want to make sure that the next time a Charlie Manson comes in, we can punish them appropriately. So there's a lot of like viewing this case as a cautionary tale, a lot of fear about this case repeating itself. Manson and the disciples are often mentioned in these legislative hearings. So here's Jerry Brown today. Here's Jerry Brown as he was when he was young and he was governor of California in the 70s. He gets letters from the ACLU, from the legislative analyst's office, from the LAPD police union saying, please don't pull the sentences up every time a crazy crime's going to come up, like a heinous crime, punishment's going to skyrocket. And Jerry Brown's not attentive to that. He listens to this helter-skelter argument, ratchets up the platform for punishment. And this is partly how we get these increasingly severe sentences in California ever since. In 1988, there's an extra layer to this, which is that's when we add the governor's veto. Before that, the governor couldn't veto the decisions. Now the governor has this political yay or nay after the board makes its decision. And on top of everything, the commissioners become political appointees by the governor. So you're looking at a page from the California Department of Corrections website. And as you can see in the pictures of the commissioners here, I'm going to move myself a little up so you can see everybody. You can see it's a pretty diverse group in terms of gender, in terms of race, but they are not at all diverse in terms of their background. Every single person that you see here comes from either a corrections background or they're a former sheriff or a former police chief. So not a single person who is a therapeutic professional, not a single psychologist or social worker, nobody who knows anything therapeutic about substance abuse, about mental illness, about a lot of the things that happen in prison. It is only much, much, much later, just in the recent 2 or 3 years, that they start appointing people from defense backgrounds, but still nobody with a professional therapeutic background is on this board. And then finally, we have this extra layer on top of everything. This is 2008 when Californians adopt a voter initiative called Marsy's Law. And that throws in the extra thing that victims, when they come to the parole board, they can bring a lot of people to support them. They can bring victim advocates. The victim advocates can bring their own advocates. So it can be actually quite a big posse coming in to support the victims at the hearing. But more importantly, they've increased the time between parole denials. So now when you're denied parole in California, the presumptive time you have to wait until your next hearing is 15 years. Because this is so much, there's often exceptions, but this is supposed to be the rule. So this gives you kind of an idea of what the law is like. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what's actually happening in this hearing. So what you're seeing in this picture is Patricia Krenwinkel, who family. She's now the oldest female inmate in California. With her attorney, Keith Watley, they're facing the commissioners talking about her case. Keith Watley runs a nonprofit in California called Uncommon Law, which represents people on parole. And he holds these trainings for lawyers that want to represent people on parole. And when you come to the training, the first thing that he tells you is, look, forget about this being a criminal trial. You're already guilty. Any effort to argue with the court record, to present your own version of events is going to fail. As you can imagine, this is a massive problem for the people that are in prison. And we know there are people in prison doing very long terms for things that they haven't actually done, people that are innocent. But if you say, I didn't do it, you haven't expressed insight. Now, insight is a really key word in California parole, and it's important to know. Insight is kind of, the best way to explain what insight is it's whatever the board wants it to be, right? Insight is sort of a combination of remorse and of looking at yourself back at the time of the crime and sort of explaining why you committed the crime, kind of, I once was blind, but now I see, but I'm changed. So it's supposed to reflect this kind of internal transformation to something else that you've gone through in prison. So the first and most important way to show this is to basically agree with anything that's in the court record. Up until sort of the mid-'80s, when I looked at the transcripts, what I saw was that the commissioners were genuinely interested in what people had to say. So for example, Susan Atkins has claimed fairly consistently since her trial that she did not actually stab anyone, including Sharon Tate, even though that's in her court record. She says Tex Watson actually did the stabbing. This is a story that Tex Watson himself confirms. So up until the mid-'80s, they're like, well, tell me your side of the story. After the mid-'80s, any effort that you make to tell a story that's different from what the court believes, you're trying to minimize, you're not showing insight. So that's really key. And the problem with insight, or one of the interesting things about using insight, is that insight is whatever they want. So if there are strong political reasons for not letting you out, they can always say this person doesn't have insight. Now, this is really important because in the last 20 years, the rule in parole hearings is that you can't deny somebody parole just based on the heinousness of the crime, right? The heinousness of the crime alone is not grounds for release. But they can always say you're not showing insight about your heinous crime, and then they don't let you out. Now, there's another interesting thing to point out about this, and that's that the prosecutor is actually present at all the hearings. So the guy you see here in the picture is Stephen Kay. He's one of the original prosecutors in the Manson family trials. He used to still come into every single hearing and actually pioneered a program in the 80s for encouraging more and more prosecutors to show up. So why do you need a prosecutor? The trial has been over for decades now. So initially, the role of the prosecutor was to explain things from the trial record. But Stephen Kay and the people that came after him actually expanded this role. And now the prosecutor does something that I call the moral memory of the board. So he's there, he feels comfortable opining about anything. He talks about risk. He asks people questions about their behaviors in prison. He'll say, so Charlie, I hear that you're drawing spiders on the walls of your prison. What's up with that? You're drawing naked ladies. What should we understand from that? You've been dating the wrong people, getting mail from the wrong people. So he feels comfortable opining, sometimes in very florid language. Sometimes he'll point at the inmate and say, you have ice in your veins instead of blood. This is from one of Patricia Krenwinkel's hearings. So feels very comfortable participating. And he's basically partnering with the increasing block of the victims at the hearing. So the woman you're seeing in the picture is Deborah Tate, who is Sharon Tate's sister, the last surviving member of the Tate family. She still shows up for every single hearing, including hearings of people who did not actually have anything to do with Sharon Tate's murder, didn't know about it at the time. When she can't show up as a victim, she shows up as a victim advocate. And just the expansion of how many people can show up on behalf of victims is really strong. Just as kind of to illustrate this, in the mid-'80s, one person would show up to Tex Watson's hearing. Now it's 17 people, pretty much regularly at every hearing. The commissioners do not limit them in time, so this can go on for 6 hours. The victims will speak for themselves. They will read letters from other victims. They will comment about family members that died before they were born. So it's a very expanded role for the victims. And I can talk more about why I think that this is not a great way to advocate, justice for the victims or for the offenders. I can tell you that in the Tate family memoir, they talk extensively about how hard it is for them to do it. They don't actually get a lot of solace or release or anything from that. And I can also tell you that they basically ban any victim opinion that is not very punitive. So at some point in the 90s, a woman called Susan LaBerge, who was a cousin of the LaBiancas, struck a friendship with Tex Watson. They were both born-again Christians, so they bonded over their faith. And she showed up at the hearing to say, I'm not actually opposing his release. I've forgiven him and what have you. After the hearing, in the parking lot, she was accosted and assaulted by Doris Tate, Sharon Tate's mom, who spat on her. This is from the Tate family memoir, so they openly essentially say that this is true. She told her, "You're a piece of shit. Your parents are rolling in their graves." And of course, Susan LaBerge never shows up again. So the only way to be a victim in California now is to be a punitive victim. So a little bit about what happens when they talk about the present. So in addition of talking about the crime the way it was, they talk about what the person's doing now. There's basically two things. They talk about disciplinary hearings and chronos, which is laudatory paperwork that you get for doing rehab programs, drug programs, anger management, what have you. So you're seeing Leslie Van Houten in the picture. She now has a master's degree. She's very, very active in prison. She has a tiny, tiny disciplinary file. What you see in these cases is that they will repeatedly come up with the disciplinary write-ups that you have from 20, 30, 40 years ago and discuss them again and again and again. They'll talk to her about having a quarter in a jacket that she borrowed from a friend or smoking marijuana in the early 80s. Sometimes they completely confuse the facts. They've been repeatedly dinging Bobby Beausoleil. They're saying, well, you had this incident with a baseball bat. Well, the thing is, he was the victim of the incident with the baseball bat. So, completely turning things out, the factual inaccuracies repeat themselves year after year from hearing to hearing. So very, very, very difficult. Now, when we talk about rehabilitation programs, we're really hitting the nail on its head, because the issue is that California prisons don't really have rehabilitative programs. Not anymore. The prison that has more of them is San Quentin, but that's because it's closer to the San Francisco Bay Area when people like me and my friends come in and teach all kinds of courses. But in prisons that are more remote, they don't really have that option. So the board, and this is one of the shocker things that I found out, is that the board regularly recommends, or requires, I should say, that people attend programs that don't exist. Yeah, programs that don't exist. Or programs that you can't even attend. So you would get dinged, for example, for not attending programs when you're in solitary confinement for your own protection. Now, for example, Bobby Beausoleil, again, is a good example here. So he became basically almost immediately an enemy of the Aryan Brotherhood, right? A white guy who doesn't want to, bond with white supremacists in prison. So he became their greatest enemy and was basically in solitary for protection from them. Nonetheless, he gets dinged for not attending programming, even though he couldn't actually physically leave his cell to attend. Now, the one type of programming that they do sort of, very strongly require everybody to do is drug programming, 12 steps. And that's because 12 steps is cheap. 12 steps is available in all prisons because they don't need professionals for that. People do it for themselves. So they require it of everyone. And whenever somebody comes up with a slightly different type of rehabilitative program, they're very suspicious. So Tex Watson, for example, became a born-again Christian shortly after coming to prison. He starts a prison ministry. They're constantly suspicious of his efforts at the prison ministry. They're saying, well, you're just doing this because you want to continue manipulating people. They do the same thing to this man, Bruce Davis. So Bruce Davis is actually now a doctor of divinity. He became a born-again Christian fairly early on in prison, very, very strong believer. And they'll be telling him at the hearing, oh, you're still a cult follower. You've just, you substituted Manson for Jesus. Now, as you can imagine, for someone who's a very devout Christian, this is incredibly offensive. So he starts arguing with them, which of course doesn't bode well for his release. And he's only recommended for release in 2012, but the governor reverses every time. Now, Bobby Beausoleil comes into prison as already an accomplished artist and musician, and they require that he teach GED and all kinds of vocational programs, and he keeps telling them, well, I already have a profession. And they say, well, we're not seeing you participating in programs. And he says, well, I've created an electronic recording studio in prison. I basically put together the prison band. So I'm actually putting together rehabilitative programs for other people, right? Because I don't really need a GED, and they ding him for being arrogant. So this kind of gives you a sense of how difficult it is to actually satisfy these constantly moving goalposts. The only one that doesn't really play the game is Manson himself, because he knows, as opposed to everybody else, that they're never letting him out. So throughout the hearings, he's, laughing and cursing at them and, jumping on the table and doing whatever he wants. And in the last 3 hearings, he doesn't even bother to show up. And they are so flummoxed by the fact that he's not there that they talk to the empty table as if he's sitting there. So you'll be reading the record and it'll say, Mr. Manson, we are speaking to you through the record, right? So they run the whole hearing as if he's there, just to kind of like show you that you continue to manipulate people even if you're not there, and well into his death a couple of years ago. So a little bit about the future. So I can talk more about letters of support, letters of opposition. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A, but what's most important for me to talk about now is this picture. The woman in the picture is Susan Atkins, and what you're seeing is her 2009 hearing. At that point, Susan Atkins was already 60. She had an inoperable brain tumor. She's being wheeled into the room on a gurney. She's non-responsive. She can't hear them. She can't see them. She sleeps for more of her hearing, and she's represented by the guy on the left with a mustache. That's James Whitehouse, her husband, who's also an attorney, who represented her at the hearings. And what happens at this hearing, which chapter 6 of my book gives you sort of a blow-by-blow of the whole thing, is really, really heartbreaking, because they're just completely ignoring the fact that this woman is lying there on a gurney. They're reading from the text. They're saying, ooh, the ADA is telling us that you need a hearing aid. And James Whitehouse is like, you don't need to give her a hearing aid. She can't hear you anyway. Right? And they'll be looking at a record and saying, well, 5 years ago, she was low risk, but she wasn't super low risk. And he's like, what's she going to do? Like, she's going to die in a few months. I just want her to die at home. And they tell him, well, do you have enough money to make sure that she has, hospice care? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to take care of her. And then they mock him for that. They say, oh, good for you that you have money. I wish I had money to take care of my relatives. Right. And on top of everything, Deborah Tate gets up at the hearing, points at her and says, she is still a danger to society, because there are still people that look up to the Manson family. And they write a decision where they don't let this woman out of prison to live the last few months of her life with her husband, right? Completely clean disciplinary record for many, many years, born again Christian since 1977, right? The only thing she got dinged for in previous hearings was she was too zealous in advocating ministering for Jesus at the prison to be fair, a literally captive audience. Is old, she's dying right in front of you, and they're like, nope, she's still a risk. And she dies alone in prison a few months later. And I think this brings us to the question, what are we going to do about this? So this is Susan Atkins again, in one of the few moments at the hearings where she looked at her husband. Yeah, we can talk more about this really, really hard stuff. This is a piece of art by Bobby Beausoleil called The Rise of Bardo. And Bardo in Tibetan Buddhism is sort of this notion of sort of a purgatory-like set of worlds or passages between when you die and when you're either reach nirvana or you're reborn. And to me, this is a huge metaphor for the whole parole thing. And I guess my question then is like, how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this purgatory? This is a really poignant question given what we're seeing now with prisoner releases facing this really dangerous health crisis. And in the book, I make a few recommendations, and I'll end with those. I recommend removing the governor veto from the process. It's an extra political layer that we don't actually need. I recommend diversifying the board. So it's not just political appointments, it's professional appointments, people whose backgrounds are vetted, people who come from therapy backgrounds, people who get extensive continuing education in substance abuse, mental health, all the things that you need to know when you're dealing with population behind bars. I recommend that you introduce really big time restorative justice processes where the victims and the offenders talk to each other, where offenders can actually offer victims apologies that are genuine because they're not hanging on that to ask for the release. So the victims can get something out of the process and they're not jamming the process for everybody else. I recommend, I guess the main recommendation in the book, I have a few more recommendations, but the most important one is we absolutely have to have robust rehabilitation programming in prisons, because we can't actually blame people for not having skills that the prison is not providing them. And it is if we create a real array of vocational training that gives people jobs that they can actually do on the outside and create a continuum between what happens in prison and what happens outside of prison, that will be able to really give people a chance and a hope to get released. And that's the only path that we have to get the hell out of Bardo. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions.
That was amazing and so fascinating and educational. So many emotions. So just to get everyone started, we are answering questions. You can type them in the chat as you're watching the video on YouTube, and we'll filter them and read them out, and then we'll answer them on the video. I would love to, this is one thing that I found very interesting. And you mentioned about wanting to talk about it more with the Tate family. And so I first learned about these victims or family members of the victims coming to parole hearings from a podcast that I enjoy called You're Wrong About. And they were talking about this sort of assault on the parole hearings and how that heavily affects the results. But also you talked about how it's not really healthy for the Tate family to keep bringing this up and, never, it's like a wound that they just keep picking the scab at. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that process and how that negatively affects this sort of false hope that prisoners are given with parole.
Sure. So I want to be very cautious here. I don't want to speak paternalistically about what other people need out of these processes, because everybody comes into these situations with different feelings. So to the extent that I'm talking about things that I'm noticing that are, creating more suffering, I'm actually quoting the Tate family themselves from their own memoir, talking about how hard it is for them to come to these hearings and how they're not really getting anything out of it and they're not getting the apology. The structure of this hearing is such that it is so performative and so artificial that it's the last place you would go to get any sort of reckoning, any sort of dialogue, any sort of apology. So if you're going in there and you're like, I want to hear the person tell me, I'm so sorry for what I did to you, the prisoners under California law are actually forbidden from speaking to the victims. Very often the victims don't know about this. So the victims will go outside, they'll give a TV interview and they'll say something like, she never told me she was sorry. They're not allowed to tell you that they're sorry. And moreover, even if they were, would you really believe somebody who told you that they're sorry at the hearing that they're trying to get out? Mm-hmm. And I should say, look, everybody processes these things, grief and sadness. And I'm actually not a stranger to grieving over loved ones who died a violent death. I lost a dear friend to homicide in 2014. I lost 9 friends to a suicide bombing in 2002. I know that this is very, very, very hard to process. I will tell you that I work with 2 violence prevention coalitions, one in Santa Rosa and one in Sacramento. And every time I go there, I speak to dozens of families who don't see things the way the Tate family does. Most of the victims of violent crime in California are poor people of color. And most of the time, somebody's mom will come up to me and say, my kid got shot by another kid over a drug deal. I don't care about the death penalty. I don't care about parole. What I want is for more kids not to die. I want for there to be more opportunities and more education in my neighborhood. These are not the people that have the wherewithal and the bandwidth and the money, let's be honest, to travel to these distant prisons to make victim statements. So we're getting a very lopsided picture of what victims actually want. I've been thinking a lot about this in the aftermath. Some of you might have heard about this horrific killing of a guy by the name of Botham Jean, shot recently by this off-duty policewoman, his neighbor, who is a white woman, Amber Geiger, who breaks into his house, basically, claiming that she thinks it's her house and shooting him. And, a crime that obviously has us all, outraged and talking about it. And then she comes to getting convicted and sentenced. And Botham Jean's brother, Branjean, who is also a devout Christian, gives her this big hug and says, I forgive you. And Twitter and NPR goes aflame, white people have been forgiven by, have benefited from Black people's forgiveness long enough, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what is it? Now we the woke are going to tell somebody how to grieve their brother? He's doing what is good for him. To me, these attacks are just as racist as the racism that they're proclaiming to condemn. So if a particular strand of victimization, kind of like the idea that the only way to be a good victim is to be super punitive and want to kill people and want them to never get out, if that's the only acceptable way to be a victim, that is erasing the voices of the majority of victims in the United States who are actually not like that. So whenever we hear somebody speaking for the victim, ask yourself who's getting the microphone and why.
No, it's a really fascinating way of looking at it too. I'm curious a little bit about your writing process. If we can talk about that, just for, you have to craft this story over 50 years and you have such extensive research. Where did you start with your research and how did this subject first come to you and why this lens?
So I think for many of us, the Manson families have haunted my dreams for decades. I mean, when the Manson murders happened, I wasn't even born yet. But I remember as a little kid going to a wax museum that had a recreation of the murders. and having this kind of like haunt my memory for decades.
Wow.
And thinking about this crime as being the quintessential crime in California. And it's only when I came to California as a criminal justice professional and started learning more about it, I realized what a stronghold this story has on the way that we view extreme crime and extreme punishment. Now, we tend to cling to these stories of horrific crimes because they are so horrible, but we also have to keep in mind that they're extremely rare. Crime rates have been falling steadily since the 80s. And part of the reason we're shocked about these murders is not only that they're very, terrifying, but also that they're not that common. So when something like that happens, we're really shaken by it, but we're shaken out of proportion, and it shapes the whole way we view the process. And this is why California now has such a bloated prison population. And this is why we're now asking ourselves, why do we actually have all these like 60 and 65-year-old sick people in prison, facing COVID? It's because we now treat everybody like Charlie Manson. We're afraid to let people out, even though just in terms of looking at public safety and risk, they don't pose any risk. These are folks who would have committed crimes 20, 30, 40 years ago. Everything we know about life course criminology tells us that people age out of crime, toward their late 20s, 30s. So what are we really doing here? We're keeping people who are old. They're not healthy because they come from impoverished backgrounds. They didn't come in healthy, right? They've abused substances. They've gotten even sicker in prison. California prisons are so terrible that, before the big court rulings about them in 2011, a person was dying every 6 days out of a completely preventable disease. And this is before there was a pandemic going on. God knows how many people are dying, because I can tell you, we already have evidence that the numbers we're seeing from prison are way lower than what they really are, right? So we're having people that are old, that are sick. A third of the correctional budget in California goes to treating these people that are disproportionately old and sick. A quarter of the population in California in prison is old and sick people. What are we doing, right? And the reason I started thinking about this, of course, long before the pandemic, is because my first book, Cheap on Crime, was about all the reforms we introduced in the aftermath of the recession. And I noticed that every time states were shrinking their prison population, which is a big deal, and we should be optimistic about it, but they're also always gearing themselves toward nonviolent inmates, because reform that addresses nonviolent inmates is always easier to sell to the public, right? You've seen the headlines now, right? Gavin Newsom is releasing people in California, including murderers. Murderers is somebody who is 55 and committed a murder when they were 22, right? So this is the violent inmates, right? People who were convicted of a violent crime decades ago. And that made me think, well, I want to know how we treat super violent people in this kind of like time of revival of mercy toward nonviolent people. Like, why are we making this distinction? And I said, I'm going to pick the most extreme violent people, the least likable, the least forgivable people I can think of, and I'm going to see how they fare. And much to my surprise, I'm speaking here also to maybe people who are interested in criminal justice and doing this work, all of this stuff is public record. None of this is hidden. You can read any parole transcript that you want. It's all available to you. So this is all material that's rich. And basically what I did is, at that point, there's thousands of pages, because every hearing is hours long, right? And so I basically went over them 3 times. The first time I had a team of students working with me. This was their group project for the spring, and they really got into it because it's the first time they learned about parole. So each of them picked one person and followed them through all the years. Then I did the second 2 stages myself. One of them is I did it by year, like I read the hearings by year just to see kind of like how things change over the years. And then I broke it. I read the whole thing the third time, and I broke it into past, present, and future, which is how they break things at the hearing. And that gave me an insight of how much you can ignore the present and the future because of the past. Like, a person could be lying in front of you, basically a vegetable, and you're not seeing them. What you're seeing is the 21-year-old who committed the crime 50 years ago.
I love hearing about how your process went and how much research that you delved into it. There's one question that we have here of going back to the ideas of the commissioner appointees. If appointees with psychotherapeutic training may be preferable to political appointees, how should these appointees be selected given the political and contested nature of psychotherapeutic theories?
I think that's an excellent question. And this digs into a point that I couldn't make at the presentation, but it is discussed in the book, which is, how do we even assess risk? Like, do we even trust psychologists with assessing risk? The short answer to this question is, we can't really trust basically anything that involves the idea that anyone subjectively can kind of like look at you, no matter what training they have, and tell whether you're dangerous or not. I will say that the people who have the most trust in their own ability to tell people who lie from people who tell the truths are cops and sheriffs. People have done studies on this, and cops always report, oh, I can totally tell, if this person is lying or not. And when they're presented with videos of true and false narratives, they're the ones that get dinged the most. So they're actually worse at doing that than general population. And just kind of like to tell you a little story about this, I went to a party shortly before I finished the book, and there was a guy who works for the California Department of Corrections there. And there was also a journalist who had been himself incarcerated in San Quentin for 30 years before he went out. And I'm talking to them about the book, and the guy from the California Department of Corrections says, oh, you should like see the hearings. They're not just basing it on what people say. They're basing it on verbal, like nonverbal language, which by the way is hogwash, because I've actually seen YouTube videos of this, and I don't know if anybody's telling the truth, and they can't either, right? And then the guy who had been at San Quentin starts giggling, and I'm like, what's funny? And he says, I was in prison for 30 years, and I saw people come up for parole all the time, and they deceive the board all the time. Like the board does not have the tools to know what's what. Wow. I think if anything, it's not so much that psychologists or social workers would know, but they would perhaps have more humility and more knowledge to know what they don't know. And they would also know something that many of us in the field know, and that's that rehabilitation is as rehabilitation does. The job of the parole board is not to let people out who are good or virtuous. There's plenty of not good, not virtuous people out there. The job of the parole board is to protect public safety. If a person is not inside transformed, I mean, I'm thinking about Shawshank Redemption, right? The kind of, Red comes up before the parole board and is all like, yeah, I'm completely rehabilitated. That's God's honest truth. It doesn't matter if this is true or not. If the person's not going to commit crime, that's fine. Does the person have a profession? Do they have an education? Do they have a supportive structure outside, family, friends, peers, somebody to help them get a job? They're not going to commit crime. Is the person in their 50s? They're not going to commit crime. So you got to think about that stuff, and I expect professionals be able to do that better. Mm-hmm. Now, it's true that the way they came to view psychology at these hearings has changed. So initially in the 70s and 80s, there would be somebody in the prison, like a prison counselor, talking to you and writing a report for your file. Increasingly, we are relying more and more on these kind of like actuarial stuff, like they pluck a bunch of stuff into a risk software and it spits out, high risk, low risk, whatever. The problem is that the board just picks whichever one they want. Like after 20 years, you already have like, dozens of these in your file. Mm-hmm. And if they want to let you out, even if the one from last year says you're low risk, there's one from 7 years ago that says you were medium risk, they're going to pick that one. Now, in the few occasions where people have appealed this to the California courts and said, hey, what are you doing? Like there's a newer one that says I'm actually not a danger to society. The court does ding the board for that, but how many people can afford to go to court?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I'm a theater and English major. Like my world subsists in fiction, and I've been able to, through these author events, been able to read so much beyond what I normally would. And it's just so fascinating to learn about. I'm curious what you would hope. You have a lot to say on the subject. You wrote a whole book on it, obviously. But if there was one thing you wanted a reader to take away, what do you think that would be?
So I'm speaking to people who might be reading this book now while the global pandemic is going on. And this is a really important message for me to send out. We are now facing a situation where our prisons have basically become incubators of this disease. All of the efforts that you're putting into staying home and wearing masks and doing all the good stuff that good boys and girls do because we've been told to do it is going to be worth nothing if there's no effort to curb these diseases inside prisons. Because while the prisoners stay inside, the guards are going in and out. You're basically creating petri dishes all around the nation where this disease is festering and killing people. Now, this is not just about, our safety, although of course the question of kind of like what's in it for me is an important one. But I will point out that people behind bars are human beings too. And even if they're doing time for a crime, they did not sign up to die for a horrible disease because they're being held behind bars. I want people to consider the fact that the Suzanne Atkins story is not a standalone. That routinely there are people who are old and sick and should be getting out on medical leave and should be getting out on geriatric leave. I am talking about hundreds of thousands of people throughout the United States who are going to die. We're going to see mass graves in these prisons unless state governors and anybody who has the ability to release people actually gets up and acts. if this is the way things operate during a pandemic, you can only imagine how it's been operating without a pandemic. I mean, just on death row in California, since the death penalty came back, 13 people were executed and more than 100 have died of natural causes. They just died behind bars. People die behind bars on life without parole. People die behind bars on life with parole. These sentences are incredibly long. These people are not actually endangering public safety. And we really need to ask ourselves in this very punitive, canceling culture where we're like, you did a horrible thing, you can never be forgiven, forever and ever and ever. Like, when does it all end, right? What does it do to them? And what does it do to us that we're unable to actually look at the person we're seeing now and all we can see is the person from decades ago? How this lack of compassion is shaping things now is something that we can see. And I think we're going to be paying a very dear price of that in the coming years. And I think that the Susan Atkins story is very instructive as to how we can sort of have this tunnel vision of looking at sort of crime and punishment in this very abstract way without actually looking into the eyes of people who are old and sick and need protection from a disease that the prison is unable to provide them. So if this is the one takeaway from this, I hope this is what you take away from this book.
Well, I recommend that everybody reads this book because you're going to take away more than just one thing. And I know that we were talking before about the the terrible timing of this pandemic. But what I find is that this book gave me such a unique perspective on it, and thinking outside of just my personal bubble of people that I care about or that I interact with. And it's a really eye-opening look and makes you tap into empathy, which is one of the things that connects us most as humans. So thank you for what you've given us in this unexpected way. It's not only a fascinating book, but it's also a really great study into the human condition. And I just thank you so much. I hope that all of you that are watching go and pick up a copy. We have copies available at tatteredcover.com, and you can order them online and get a copy of Yesterday's Monsters, which, now that I'm thinking about the title after this talk, is just such a good title. Well done. Is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
People have asked me in the very few appearances I was able to do before the pandemic hit, people were asking, like, why didn't you pick some, poor sympathetic person? Like, why'd you have to pick the Manson family to tell this story? And what I say is, I mean, there's many reasons why this is a good case study, but the story I have to tell is so compelling. And the way this process works is so Kafkaesque that if you find a place in the ember of your heart to connect with the Manson family, try to connect to the rest of the family of man.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a perfect note to add on. So once again, check out Yesterday's Monsters. You can purchase it at tatteredcover.com, and check out the rest of the events that we have. And I'm sure that Hadar has many as well that you can check out if you want to learn more about this subject, as well as read it in her book, because that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So Hadar, if you will stay on for just a moment, we're going to sign off here and say thank you, everybody. Stay safe, wash your hands, all that jazz. Until next time. Thanks, everyone.